break it down. Now, to better understand this concept, we're going to be talking about what exactly Undisputed is in boxing. Now, Undisputed is basically, if you have one belt, you're just a champion. If you have two belts, you're 2 to 3 belts, you're unified. Obviously, if you have 3, you're just one step away from Undisputed. If you have all 4 belts, plus the Ring Magazine belt, you are officially Undisputed. Although the Ring Magazine is a topic for its own video, if you have all 4 belts, you're essentially the champion. To further expand upon this point, I think it's important we talk about why people want Undisputed. It sounds pretty self-explanatory, People want to be the man. If you want a title, you got to go through me in their respective weight class. Undisputed was not always universally like, hey, I'm the man. You got to go through me. One of the best examples is Larry Holmes in the 80s. Late 70s, early 80s. I think he only had 1 belt, but all the champions were so far inferior to him that, there's no point in fighting them. The contenders were better. Jerry Cooney, he beat Ken Norton for the title. It's like, I can't think, because there's a laundry list of people that Larry Holmes beat in his title reign. He had like 18 defenses, I'm pretty sure. 19 defenses. So there's a whole laundry list, and at least 7 of those guys are like elite names. So just to give you an example, or Lomachenko, I gotta talk about my boy, right? He was looked at as the best lightweight, but still Richard Comey had the IBF, then Lopez. And that segues very good into my next point. So, first example I'm going to go over with why Undisputed is overrated. We got to dial the clock back 5 years to 2020. Loma versus Lopez and Haney fiasco, aka Mauricio Sulaiman being an asshole. So, what ended up happening was Loma had 3 out of the 4 belts. He was fresh off of beating the brakes off of Luke Campbell, having a super dominating run at lightweight, unifying 3 out of the 4 belts, and having the Ring Magazine belt, which, for the sake of this video, the Ring Magazine belt really doesn't count. That really is a topic in of its own, but he had 3 out of the 4 belts. That same year, Lopez was handling his own work and brutally knocked out, probably knockout of the year contender with Richard Comey. He had the IBF. Now, the IBF is not important for this point. I'll be talking about them later. Don't get it twisted. But basically what ended up happening is that Haney was the mandatory for Loma. Now, I went back and forth with one of my friends about this, but let's be real. Loma would have torn Haney to ribbons in 2019. Haney didn't want that smoke, talking about he ducked me for 4 years, but that's besides the point. It's superfluous. What I was going to say was Haney was Loma's mandatory, and Loma needed to fight him. What ended up happening was, since Loma, I think he went over the limit of when he could fight Haney. Haney was technically the real WBC champion when Loma fought, when he fought Tio. Now, the thing about that is that Loma had a version of the WBC belt, but he had the WBC franchise. Now, the reason why that happened, it's sort of speculated, but if you ask for my 2 cents, I think good old scumbag Bob Arum, probably made a deal under the table with the WBC to market the Lopez and Loma fight as undisputed, even though the only real belts being fought for are the WBA, WBO, and IBF. So it was really only for Unified. And made Haney the real WBC champion and Loma the WBC franchise champion, which is a secondary belt. And this leads well into my next. Now, another main reason that the WBC did this bullshit, this pile of malarkey, was for extra sanctioning fees. It's pretty self-explanatory. You make 2 belts, one of them real, one of them bullshit. You put Haney on the periphery for maybe 2 to 3 years before he fights anybody relevant, credible, or recognizable. You make him the real champion, but put him on the periphery so no one gives a shit about him. And you market this fight for undisputed. You do that, and you get more money. You have your cake and eat it too. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, this is where the waters really get murky. Belt organizations competing for power and why it's a real issue. And I'll combine it with my next point. Terrible mandatories becoming email champions. Now, a lot of these sanctioning bodies conflict. They, for example, when Dmitry Bivol, one of my favorite boxers, became undisputed, after he beat Beterbiev, beat him proper, he's basically contractually obligated to which I'll get more into later, but he was contractually obligated to fight Beterbiev 3 times. He maybe enjoyed undisputed for a month or 2, right? And this is where I think this actually, I never really thought about it like this. They fought for undisputed twice, but one of those sanctioning bodies, the IBF, automatically strips you if you have a mandatory. But for whatever reason, they did not strip Beterbiev after the first Bivol fight. So that's another big problem with these sanctioning bodies. They make rules up as they go, right? So basically, as soon as Bivol becomes undisputed, a month or 2 after, Benavidez has already had 2 fights at light heavyweight, about to have a 3rd against Anthony Yard, which that's going to be a good fight. Not a fight I'm going to cover, but I'm only covering the most important fights, or fights that I find the most competitive. Regardless, David Benavidez becomes, I believe, the deserving WBC champion because he's a good fighter. But keep in mind, Bivol's stuck in a contract with Turki Al-Sheikh and Beterbiev, right? And he can't, if he tries to breach the contract, he could get sued, which would delay the fight and destroy his funds, and I shouldn't really even have to explain to you why he should not breach his contract. But to further elaborate upon that point, some random no-name Polish guy, because Bivol could not come to an agreement, or did not even care to come to an agreement with this Polish boxer, he's not even worth mentioning, he is now the IBF champion. And this leads well into my next point. Terrible mandatories becoming email champions. If these guys get maybe couple of months at best, at least with Loma at the end of his career, after he beat the brakes off Kambosos, he got basically a year and a half to decide whether he wanted to vacate or retire. He ended up retiring. But Bivol, on the other hand, Beterbiev doesn't get stripped, yet Bivol gets stripped right after he becomes undisputed, even though Beterbiev should be stripped by the IBF's logic, because they were contractually in an agreement that there was an automatic rematch clause, irrespective of who won. A 3-fight series, basically. Insane. Now, another problem with all of the sanctioning bodies is once you become a champion in any sanctioning body, any of the alphabet soup belts, WBO, WBA, WBC, IBF, right? You are officially, you can no longer compete in any of those sanctioning bodies. Now, why is this a problem? If you can't fight your way up with enough title defenses in one particular sanctioning body, you basically have to go through third parties, either your promoter and management, if you're on one promotion like Top Rank or Golden Boy or Matchroom or PBC, just to name a few. You have to go through your promoter and management. You know what I mean? Instead, what would be easier and what logically makes more sense, instead of going through third parties, is if you put in enough quality work, instead of having to wait months upon months to sign, ink on a dotted line and negotiations and all that shit. Obviously, you'd have to do that regardless, but it would make it a lot more sense if it was automatic and, basically if you could rack up enough title defenses and make yourself a mandatory in another weight class. You know what I mean? Now, to sort of wrap up my long-winded point, another example is the IBF. They're another one that is like really dirty as well. So, and also ties in the point I was talking about before. So, Spence versus Crawford. After years of fans waiting, Spence and Crawford finally get in the ring. Spence gets destroyed. Crawford becomes undisputed. He's only undisputed for maybe 3 months, right? Because the IBF has a rule, quote-unquote rule, where if you have a mandatory rematch clause that you're contractually obligated to, and the repercussions are worse if you just say, hey, I don't really want to fight you. You can't just say no to a mandatory rematch clause, because you're going to get sued out your ass, right? So instead of, waiting for the rematch to happen, then forcing the mandatory, instead they strip him, they make Boots Ennis the mandatory, which Boots Ennis is a great fighter, but that does not matter to this video. And then, before you know it, Crawford's only fights like once a year, so the belt organizations just start stripping him and stripping him and stripping him, you know what I mean? And that's another example, the IBF. But the IBF are hypocrites because, for whatever reason, people already knew going into the Bivol and Beterbiev fight that they were going to face at least a second time. And for whatever reason, Beterbiev did not get stripped by the IBF. Kind of fishy. Even though there was a mandatory rematch clause in place, and in their rule book, it specifically says you cannot fight, you cannot keep the IBF if you fight in a mandatory rematch that's contractually obligated. We will strip you. Don't know why that's a rule, but it is. Glad I remembered this point. Yes, egregious sanctioning fees when you have all 4 belts. Errol Spence brought this up before his fight with Crawford, before he got mixed and his brains got turned into fudge. For each belt you collect, you have to pay 4% of your purse. If you have, for example, right, if you're unified, you got to pay 8%. If you have 3 belts, you got to pay 12%. If you have all 4 and you defend it multiple times, you got to give 16% of your purse to the sanctioning bodies. That's big. It might not sound like a lot. You got to give 16% of your purse to the sanctioning fees, the sanctioning bodies. Let's say you make $1 million purse and they collect 16%, just to make the math easy. They're taking $160,000 off top. Then you got to pay at least a third of your purse to your team. So that's like something like 49%, so half of your purse is gone. That's like 490,000 out of a $1 million purse. Then you have to pay 8% to tax. Obviously, I'm just talking because I live in New York. I mean, I'm not exposing my location past that. But let's say you have to pay 8% in tax, right? So you're losing over 50% of your purse, and you're only making $430,000, and then you bills on top of that, not even factoring that in off the top. And the sanctioning fees are a big part to thank for that. Final thoughts / outro. In conclusion, if sanctioning bodies could come to an agreement and work together more instead of clashing and making rules up on the fly, Undisputed would probably have more meaning. As it stands, it's probably in a fighter's best interest, from fees to other nonsense, to simply be unified, collecting 2 to 3 belts max plus the ring magazine. Like, gotta glaze him again, my man Loma. Or Larry Holmes is another good example, even though he had 1 belt. Longevity, I'll add this point in at the end. Longevity probably means more in terms of belts than collecting multiple. You know what I mean? This is Fightsci signing out.